You feel good. Anytime. 919.
So it is a Tuesday afternoon. We do this every Tuesday afternoon. We find out from our property gurus a little bit of information as to what we should know when it comes to buying, renting, or owning a home. And he's back with us this afternoon. A big shout out to you. Hello, Harry, from Etchells and Young. Lucky to have you on the show once again, bud.
Hi, Al. Thanks so much, man. Yeah, always a pleasure being here. Glad we can chat.
Yeah, I believe you're down with the flu. This is why we're doing the telephonic this afternoon. So, firstly, let's wish you all the best that you get that you beat that bug that you have, and thank you for considering us and not bringing it to the studio.
Thanks. Oh, yeah, this man flu, horrible stuff. I tell you what. Yeah,
I can just imagine. So our topic this afternoon, Harry, and for the week, I would imagine. We're going to be chatting rental agreements, leases and breaches and cancellations of these contracts. And I suppose the first question I have for you, a lease agreement is still a contract, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It is, and most people these days do tend to take it very lightly.
Yeah.
Because it seems it can be so easily cancelled, and I think that's probably indicative of where we are in society these days. Instant gratification, instant meals, instant flip and checker, 60/60 deliveries. Everything is there, and you can change it and you can cancel it exactly when you want. And people tend to think it's the same with the lease agreement, but it's still a contract. And if you think about it, in the Sandton area, the contract represents a tenant who's paying, let's say, for argument's sake, 25,000 grand a month.
Yeah.
And in exchange, a landlord's giving him a 3.5 million rand property.
Yes.
So both of those have rights and obligations and have interest to protect. So that contract is actually still quite important.
Yeah. And does the deposit not deter anybody from cancelling the contract? Because surely, if I'm renting a place, before I get to sign the lease, I have to send you some kind of monetary value to secure that lease
of a deposit. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it can. It definitely can, because the reason of the deposit is to give the landlord some comfort that if things go wrong, there's some money left to cover his costs. Especially, but it's meant to be for the repairs and maintenance at the end of the lease.
Yeah.
But it definitely can. Again, it also depends on the value of that deposit. And typically in our world, an unfurnished property is going to be 1 month's deposit. There's going to be other factors that potentially come into that. And if it's a furnished property, it's going to be 2 months deposit. But, realistically, let's take that 3.5 million rand property. I mean, that's going to have 200 grand's worth of furniture, and if it's furnished.
Yeah.
So your 25 grand is going to cover 10% of the furniture that's in there potentially.
Yeah. So is there a difference between a breach and a cancellation? Is a cancellation automatic? If there has been a breach, how does that all work?
Okay, so I mean, the link between those two, the typical clause in the agreement is going to be breach and cancellation. So the two are definitely linked. But no, it's a good question. It's not automatic that if there's a breach, there will be a cancellation, because we have to describe it like this: a breach is an action or lack of action by a party.
Yeah.
But in order for the cancellation to happen, that person must be notified that they're in breach, and they must be told what they need to do to rectify or remedy that breach. And if we go back to last week's eviction, the first step in that eviction was that notice. There's a letter of demand or notice of breach. That's pretty much the same thing, the letter of demand, but there's a formal notice that's got to go out to say, hey, you're in breach, and if you don't remedy this breach, then there's going to be a cancellation of this lease. So the two are different, but they're interrelated, and definitely no automatic, because I don't think either landlord or tenant necessarily wants to cancel the lease at the drop of a hat for any old thing that kind of goes wrong, but they kind of want the other party to toe the line, either the landlord to come and fix and make sure this property is habitable and that I can enjoy living here. And the same thing, if a tenant makes a noise around every other day, that you just stop that, but continue, in the property.
Now, I know you've probably answered this question, but what typically constitutes a breach of a lease agreement?
So, obviously, in legal terms, the breach is that act of either omission or deliberate act that contravenes the stipulations of the lease. So that lease agreement, as I said, is setting out to protect both parties, in fact, but realistically, every tenant complains, why is the lease so one-sided towards the landlord? And it's because the landlord's investment in this arrangement is significantly higher than the tenant's. But so both parties can do things that's gonna break the spirit, either the spirit or the actual terms of that agreement. And when they do that, so when you either, as I said, it doesn't have to be an action; it can be an omission too. When you fail to pay your rent, that's typically the biggest act of breach that we see. If a tenant fails to pay the rent on time, they have breached the agreement.
All right, let's play devil's advocate here for a second. I'm renting a house and I have got water pouring out of one of the light fittings in the ceiling. I phone my landlord and my landlord says I'll get there when I can, and a couple of days later nobody's come through to fix the said leak. Are they in breach? Do I just get somebody to repair it and bill him at the end of the month and take it off my rent, or how? What would be the recourse there? Is that breach, by the way?
That's a very good example. So again, the omission by the landlord not to act quickly and timelessly in that case, because water pouring out of a light fitting is quite a serious issue. I mean, there's all sorts of other electrical risks and dangers that the tenant might be exposed to.
Yes.
So that omission would definitely be an act of breach. But again, you can't just go because the landlord hasn't pitched up in 2 days' time and now you're cancelling your lease. You first have to place them in breach, and it's a legal process and a legal procedure, and you got to tell them what the problem is, and you got to tell him how long in terms of the lease. And a repair item like that is now going to be urgent. So maybe you're not going to put a X amount of days or hours to it, but it's going to be an urgent thing to attend to. So for sure, he has to attend to it, but he has to be notified. And if he fails to attend, then you can start the procedure of cancelling that lease.
Okay. And when can a landlord or a tenant cancel a lease? When does that happen?
We've spoken about a few of those things already. So first of all, both the Rental Housing Act and the Consumer Protection Act consider a lease to form an initial period. So typically in our lives, that's the first 12 months of the lease.
Yeah.
And thereafter, that lease automatically continues on a month-to-month basis, provided that it's not cancelled by either the landlord or the tenant. So therefore, the first time that either the landlord or the tenant, or not the first time, but the obvious time to cancel or terminate that lease is going to be the end of the initial period if either one of those two don't want to continue. Then the second part is, generally speaking, during the term of the lease, the landlord doesn't have any right, not in terms of the Rental Housing Act anyway, to cancel that lease. So only the tenant can cancel via the Consumer Protection Act, unless there's a stipulation in that lease that allows the landlord the right to cancel. And typically that would be if the property was sold, or if the landlord is living abroad and moves back to Joburg and wants to move back into his house. If that's contained in his lease, and obviously if the tenant has agreed to that by signing the lease, then that's when the landlord can cancel. Now, the tenant has been given greater rights in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, and I guess this goes back to the Middle Ages and feudal times, where you had noblemen who owned vast tracts of land and tenants who lived in properties and were quite significantly, what's the word I'm looking for? They, not treated very well, badly prejudiced, and through the progression of time, tenant rights and everything has come into it. And obviously, in modern days, almost in any country around the world, you have Consumer Protection Acts or similar, and the tenants now have very specific rights. One of those rights in the South African Consumer Protection Act is that the tenant can at any time, for any reason, without disclosing it, cancel that lease agreement. So now we spoke about right in the beginning about, is a lease a real contract? And here is a law that has given one of the parties a right to cancel that for any reason at any time. Okay. So that is when those leases can be cancelled. Just a few examples.
So you did mention a couple of months ago that the Consumer Protection Act, or you mentioned the Consumer Protection Act nevertheless. When does that come into play, and is there a reasonable cancellation penalty? And if so, how does that all work?
Yeah, for sure. So as we said now, so the Consumer Protection Act, and as I often remind our agents during training sessions, is not the Landlord Protection Act or the Agent Protection Act. It's the Consumer Protection Act for a very specific reason. It's the rights around that, and in this case, Section 14 of the Act allows the tenant to cancel at any time, but it says that the landlord may, and I mean the word may here in law is quite significant. It doesn't have to, or definitely, the landlord may. In other words, he has the option to, he has the right to impose a reasonable cancellation penalty. And that cancellation penalty, there's a couple of kind of boxes it must tick. Firstly, it must be agreed to in the lease, so there needs to be a reference to it in the lease agreement. And the landlord has to do whatever he can to mitigate his losses in the case of this cancelled agreement. And the first obvious one is obviously do act diligently and find a new tenant to replace the existing tenant, so that he doesn't sit for 3 months without a tenant paying tenant in the property.
Fair enough. And you know what that just made me think of? If you want to cancel your cell phone contract with one of the big networks, you have to pay a reasonable cancellation penalty.
Cancellation penalty.
Yeah,
it's the same CPA, but let's not start on that. I've just had another fight with my guys because I'm on a month-to-month, or anyway, in my mind I was on a month-to-month, and they're still coming with a cancellation penalty. I'm saying, but for what? I've paid off my device. Now I must still pay. But if you want to do business with them, that's what they do.
Gee whiz. So speaking of landlords charging a cancellation penalty, can you give us an example of something like that?
Yeah, I can for sure. And we actually had a case about 2 years ago that went to the Rental Housing Tribunal. So this is a nice case because it lays out a couple of the principles that certainly the Rental Housing Tribunal and in some parts of the law will look at when it comes to a reasonable cancellation penalty. And the first thing is, this thing is called a reasonable cancellation penalty. It must be reasonable. Now, even though reasonable is not defined in the Act, the principle of reasonableness comes into play. And in other words, it must be fair. And one of the first aspects that specifies is that you cannot have a cancellation penalty that negates the right to cancel or the benefit of cancelling. In other words, you can't say your cancellation penalty will be all the rest of the rent until the end of your lease, because clearly then the tenant's right is negated. So in this particular case in the tribunal, we had a tenant that was actually, he only had 2 more months to run in the lease, but it was a Sandton property, so it was quite I think it was a 30 or 35,000 in rental, so it was a fair amount of rent. He then cancelled the lease. We informed him of the cancellation penalty. This guy got his back up a little bit, and then immediately became very restrictive in the viewings for new potential tenants, and he said stuff like, they can only view before 8 in the morning and after 5 because I'm working. And really, it made it very, very difficult. All of this was presented to the tribunal. They heard the case. He gets his turn to put it through. We represented the landlord, and we put his case forward. And at the end of the day, the tribunal came down, and they ruled in favor of the landlord to say that by charging 1 month's cancellation penalty was not unreasonable, because the landlord actually suffered a loss of 1 month's rent. As soon as we were allowed access to view, our agent found and placed a new tenant, and so there was that 1 month gap, And had it not been for the actions of this tenant being restrictive and possibly a bit vindictive,
there wouldn't have been a gap.
we may have found a tenant a whole lot sooner, and then he wouldn't have paid anything because the landlord had agreed in writing with him. If I find a new tenant straight away, you allow reasonable viewings, then there won't be a penalty. So yeah, the guy unfortunately shot himself in the foot and had to pay that cancellation penalty. So one of the things that comes out of that is that the rental housing tribunal, who, even though they carry exactly the same powers as a magistrate's court when they make a ruling, it's a court order, their rulings don't become legal precedent. In other words, you can't use the outcome of this case and say, like, a next similar case is going to be like that. They're going to rule every case on a case-by-case basis, whereas in court, there'll be legal precedent because the magistrate or the judge ruled in a certain way. You can assume they're going to rule like that going forward. But the one thing that they have said is, the reasonableness that we spoke about must be supported and should be the actual loss of income that the landlord suffered. Now, most agents do have a clause in the lease to say that, should you cancel early, and they'll reference the CPA, you'll be charged either 1 or 2 or 3 months, and that'll be your cancellation penalty. And that's all fine as a point to start from. But then what you need to do in reality is when the guy's actually cancelled and you actually get to the end of it, you have to work out, okay, where are we now? And what's the actual loss that the landlord suffered, and then work that back to what was in the actual lease agreement.
Fair enough. Sure, I've got a question that I'm going to throw at you, Harry. If I'm renting, because I think many people can relate. If I'm renting a property and I'm coming to the end of my lease, I've handed in my my notice that I will not be renewing the lease, or maybe even the owner has said, listen, it's time that we part ways, and there comes a time where people need to view. When does it become unreasonable for the tenant when it comes to viewing? Because I've known of estate agents that will phone you out of the blue and say, listen, I'm bringing somebody in half an hour to come and view the property.
Yeah. Oh, that is quite a good point, and there's no absolute direct or straight answer. So most lease agreements, again, will make provision that in the last month or the last 2 months, the tenant allow at least X amount, and they might stipulate 8 or 10 viewings.
Yeah.
But if we go back to exactly what happened in the rental tribunal case that I mentioned, that guy was just being plain difficult and refused to allow any viewings, which meant the landlord had no realistic chance of finding another tenant. And I guess the way that we're going to measure that is if we have, and we're going to have to record it, let's say, in case something like this goes to the rental tribunal, sorry,
yes.
Man flu affecting my brain. But if we have tenants or prospective tenants viewing saying, I can't come after 5 because, I live out far away and I can only come over my lunch break at 12 o'clock type of thing.
Yeah.
And if we have a number of cases like that where people simply cannot view in a restrictive slot that they've been given, then I guess that will speak to what's fair and reasonable, and being reasonable in these circumstances. I think, absolutely not allowing any viewings is clearly unreasonable, but making provision, because we've got to take into account as well the current tenant who's in there.
Yeah.
Also works potentially,
yep.
And also has to make arrangements to get from work back to view. And what we do try and do then, but it is more difficult the sort of more upmarket the property gets.
Yeah.
But it's to try and do a block, and we say between 3 and 5 we're gonna fit in 6 or 7 viewings, and you try and do it that way,
which is fair.
Which is fair and reasonable, because okay, that's only once a week. Let's say it's going to be on a Monday, or it's going to be on a Wednesday, or whatever, and then the tenant has made that available, and then that shouldn't be a problem. But I think it's when it becomes outside the lines of what everyone expects as normal, or completely restrictive, that we start seeing problems with that.
Yeah, because let's be honest. I mean, you have to be on call all the time for viewing. So you don't know if you can have a shower because obviously you're going to mess up the bathroom, and you've tried to keep the place nice and tidy for the viewers. And you don't know if somebody's going to pop in just all of a sudden while you're cooking dinner even. And you've got your kitchen in a whole big mess.
Hopefully that won't happen, because that's also part of it is one of the biggest rights that a tenant has in a rental property is a right to privacy.
Yeah. And
again, it doesn't. The law doesn't specify timelines, but it just says the landlord may view on reasonable notice. With this reasonable thing coming through again. So what's reasonable notice? Acceptable to you and acceptable to me. That's reasonable.
Yeah. Chano, we've come to the end of our time, Harry. Always lekker chatting with you because you bring so much to the table. But I'm sure we'll definitely be doing it. We'll definitely be doing it in the future again. But if people want to get a hold of you, Harry, how do they do that? Just give us some details again.
Yep. The easiest is going to be just an email. So Harry, HARRY, at etchelsandyoung.co.za. It's ETCHELLS and then AND and then Young, YOUNG.co.za. And obviously the same for the website. There's a whole lot of additional info and list your properties and all the rest, and view and find properties available on the website.
Lekker, Harry. Well, once again, thanks for chatting with us. We're going to cross over to Jackie Roux. She's going to let us know what the property of the week is. Let's quickly have a chat with her and see what she has as far as the property of the week goes this week.
A very good afternoon all, and thanks so much for the opportunity to share our property of the week with you. Myself and my colleague Tanya have a large multi-level home in Florida, Rudderport, which has just been listed today. It's set on a stand of just over 2,000 square meters, with over 600 square meters being under roof. The home offers 6 bedrooms, all with ensuite bathrooms, and it can definitely double up as a residential space plus an office space or a work from home setup. The home has a kitchen which has a separate scullery, both lounge and dining areas, plus a sunroom which leads to the patio. And there is extensive parking available with a double automated garage, undercover parking for about 6 vehicles, and then additional open parking too. There's a very well-sized front and back garden, and other outdoor features include a swimming pool, covered patio and braai area, and then a separate cottage or staff accommodation. The great thing about the property is it's supported by a borehole with filtration, and the garden has an irrigation system installed, and then there's also 3-phase electricity to the home, which makes it suitable for high demand use. With its layout and size, the property is well suited for a large family, or there is the option of a potential conversion into a guest house or income generating property. It's listed at 3.2 million rand, and as I said earlier, it's just been listed today. And if you're interested in viewing it or getting more information, please feel free to contact me. My name is Jackie Roux, and I'm available on my cell phone on 078 4040 771. Alternatively, you can contact me on email at jackie@etchelsandyoung.co.za. That's JACKIE. Thanks so much once again for the opportunity to share our property of the week with you.
Let's go! 919, The Drive Train. 3 to 6 p.m. with Al and Lesedi. No roadblocks, no detours. Just great vibes.